I call the honourable member Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm speaking on the proposal by the government to appoint Tony Ryle to the Intelligence and Security Committee. I think in considering this proposal, we need to give ourselves a little bit of context. And that context starts with, doesn't finish with, but starts with the extraordinary events internationally of the last week, whereby the international spying by the PRISM software run by the National Security Agency was revealed to the world by Mr Snowden, who, as a leaker or a whistleblower, exposed the existence of an enormous conspiracy, effectively, which was that the National Security Agency was spying on the electronic communications of basically everyone in America, and essentially the electronic communications of most people in the world, because so much of our internet traffic passes through there. Now, the reason why that matters to us is not only because the National Security Agency would have been spying on everyone in this House and pretty much everyone in New Zealand who uses the internet, because at some point or another the traffic is routed via the United States, but rather because it's not only an issue because of what the NSA would have collected, it's also an issue because of what might the intelligence communities be doing in New Zealand, and the oversight that the Intelligence and Security Committee is supposed to provide to those agencies. So were the reports that PRISM generated, were those reports sent back to New Zealand, to the New Zealand security agencies, and those reports, were they looking at what New Zealanders were doing? We don't know the answer to that. The Prime Minister tells us that that's not true, but of course the Prime Minister either has no idea, as we've seen in the past, or simply isn't revealing the full truth. He doesn't answer many questions about this issue, and when he does answer them, they're not always right. So we don't know how much of the PRISM information was being passed back to the security services here. But what we also don't know is whether the security agencies in New Zealand are attempting to establish their own domestic version of PRISM, whether that's what the Palantir company is trying to do. Palantir is a company established by some Silicon Valley high-tech people, along with the CIA. The CIA were one of the founding investors in the company in order to promote whether data mining or data analysis on a very large scale, and it would appear that they have government contracts in New Zealand now and are embedded in some government organisations, from what PRISM put on their website, though the Prime Minister refuses to tell us, as usual. So the question is, have the security agencies established a similar kind of framework here, and shouldn't the Intelligence and Security Committee be able to provide the kind of oversight over those kind of activities? Now, in other jurisdictions, the parliamentary oversight is taken a lot more seriously than it is in New Zealand. They have proper committees and they have real powers. For example, the Norwegian committee is actually not made up of MPs, purposely made up of non-MPs, so that it's independent of Parliament. It has powers to require intelligence agents to appear. It has the power to make those intelligence agents hand over information. The Intelligence and Security Committee in New Zealand has no such powers. It can't force people to appear, it can't force them to hand over information. Under the amendments that are being proposed by the government, that won't be changed. Basically, they won't have to give us information on the Intelligence and Security Committee about what they're doing. So it's very difficult to have the kind of oversight that we need when we don't have the Intelligence and Security Committee as a proper committee. I actually think if you look at other jurisdictions, even more of the Westminster-style jurisdictions, they don't have ministers on these committees. By rule, ministers can't sit on the Intelligence and Security Oversight Committees, for the obvious reason that the ministers representing the executive can't provide independent oversight of what is an arm of the executive in the security services. So in New Zealand, we see that we have the Prime Minister chairs the committee, who's also the minister responsible for the services, for the intelligence services, an immediate conflict of interest, and then we have two other ministers sitting on the committee. A majority of the committee are ministers. So the executive has given itself authority and a majority on the committee that's meant to oversee the executive's operations of the intelligence services. It is obviously not a serious kind of oversight. So appointing yet another minister, Tony Ryle, as whatever may be the excellent qualities of Tony Ryle that Jerry Brownlee described, having a minister, another minister, on the Intelligence and Security Committee undermines its function and its purpose to provide oversight of the executive's operation of the intelligence services. It is a clear conflict of interest, which is why in other jurisdictions you can't be a minister and sit on the security oversight committees because it's so obviously a conflict of interest. Likewise, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, who's also meant to provide some kind of oversight. The Inspector General should be an officer of Parliament. Instead, essentially, the Inspector General works with the Executive. The Inspector General should be an officer of Parliament, like the Auditor General, or like the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, who reports to Parliament rather than reporting to the Executive. If we want to have proper oversight of these agencies, then we need to set up proper oversight functions. And what we've seen internationally with PRISM, with the growth, the tremendous growth of the secret surveillance state, though not so secret anymore because it's all been revealed, or some of it's been revealed, I guess. What we've seen with the growth of the surveillance state, we desperately need dramatically improved oversight of the intelligence agencies. And the Intelligence and Security Committee simply is unable, because of its legislative mandate, to provide that kind of oversight. It is impossible for the Intelligence and Security Committee, as it is statutorily defined at the moment, and including the amendments the government's pushing through, it's impossible for that committee to do its function. In fact, some of the legislative change that the government's proposing will enable the security services to operate more of a PRISM-type scheme. The changes they're making to the GCSB Act will mean that the GCSB can spy on all New Zealanders, whereas previously it was supposed to not be spying on New Zealanders. Of course, it was spying on New Zealanders, but it was supposed to not be. Likewise, the changes to the Telecommunications Act will give the intelligence agencies the ability to require the telecommunications companies to give them backdoor access to all internet traffic in New Zealand, just like the PRISM system. So they are giving themselves the powers to establish at a New Zealand level something like what we've seen in the United States with PRISM. That's exactly what the changes to the Telecommunications Act are all about. Now, this is, I believe, a deeply disturbing development. And of course, it's risen since 9/11, and particularly, it was there before, but it's gotten much worse since then, and especially as the technological capacity of the state to monitor and provide surveillance of all electronic and online communications has developed further and further, we are now in a total surveillance environment. Everyone, whenever they go online, can't be sure whether they're being surveyed by the National Security Agency in the United States or by the New Zealand Security Services. And that fundamentally corrodes privacy. At a fundamental level, that is like 1984, where you had the television on the screen and you could never know whether they were watching you or not. And that is the kind of environment we have now established with regard to online communications. Now, that fundamentally undermines privacy, and privacy is fundamental to being a complete human being. If you have no space and no time of your own where you know that you are communicating with other people in confidence, where you can discuss ideas honestly and openly, where you can have thoughts in an uncensored manner, you cannot possibly develop your identity as a person. And that is exactly what the 1984 was all about and what George Orwell was warning us about, and that is exactly the kind of total surveillance state which has now been established. And that is what Mr. Snowden has revealed to us the National Security Agency was doing in the United States. And we have no idea whether that is what the New Zealand security agencies are also trying to establish here. And we don't have the legislative tools and the legislative teeth to actually find out what is going on inside those agencies. That is why we have supported a proper inquiry, not only to what's happened with regard to Ian Fletcher and so forth, but more importantly, what is the role of these kind of agencies? How much do we need them? And if we need them, what kind of proper parliamentary oversight and democratic oversight do they need in order to protect our privacy, in order to protect our fundamental freedoms and democratic rights?
I call the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr. Speaker, Jerry Brownlee today